The Choices and Challenges Forum series was developed at Virginia Tech to explore the ethical and social dimensions of science and technology. The following presentation, taken from one of the forums in the Choices and Challenges series, is made possible by a grant from the Center for Excellence in Undergraduate Teaching. Additional support has been provided by Video Broadcast Services and the Center for Interdisciplinary Studies at Virginia Tech.
In today's program, we turn our attention to the advances that have been made in computer and communications technologies. Advances that now permit computers to be connected to each other along vast fiber optic superhighways reaching throughout the world, that reduce the communication time from anywhere in the world to mere fractions of a second, that can open up vast stores of information with the click of a key, and that can link human beings together in a new kind of community, an electronic community, an electronic village. Virginia Tech's own community of Blacksburg, Virginia, is now the location of a pilot study, one of the first of its kind, to see how an electronic village might function. In dramatic new ways, the electronic village can connect teachers with students and parents, physicians with their patients, employers with their employees, and citizens with their government representatives. What opportunities does it bring? What problems or concerns can it create? What do we need to do to deal with the difficulties we see now, and how can we act now to avoid others before they arise? Our panel today will help us probe the possibilities and problems that an electronic village may bring to the different environments in which we live, and help us determine what living in an electronic village may do to our quality of life. And now, the moderator of today's program, Paul Evan Peters.
Our fifth speaker is Deborah Johnson. Deborah is professor of philosophy in the Department of Science and Technology Studies at Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute. She's the author of the very highly regarded book which is published by Prentice Hall on computer ethics, which entered its second edition in 1994, and she has a new anthology coming out in the near future with Helen Nesselbaum that, in fact, it just came out, and it's on the subject of computer ethics and social values, and it's also published by Prentice Hall. And our final guide today is Marc Rotenberg. Marc is the director of the Electronic Privacy Information Center in Washington, D.C. He specializes in privacy issues and also on issues of equity and access to technology. He's a tournament chess player, and he's a former director of the Washington office of the Computer Professionals of Social Responsibility.
We've now heard quite a bit about the different contexts that are going on in the electronic village, online on the internet, and we've heard about education and work and government and healthcare. And what I would like to do is draw our attention to the character and quality of social life in the electronic village, or social life online. What I really want to do, since there has been so much publicity and so much discussion of the promises and hopes of this new technology, I want to sort of counter the hype a little bit by pulling us down to earth and reminding us that the activities that go on in the electronic village very much reflect the kind of people that we are and the activities that we've done in the past and been doing, that continue to do. And the shape of the electronic village will really be rooted in who we are and what kind of people we are and what we value and the activities we're now engaging in, what we care about. And in that respect, I want to suggest that in some sense we have here a solution without serious problems, or in this respect, that I think that this new technology will change our lives, but it's not clear to me that it will solve our most serious and pressing problems. And so I want to point out that the evolution of this technology has not been without problems, and I want to suggest to you that the problems that have been developed or that we've witnessed online are really the same problems that we have offline. In particular, I want to draw our attention to the problems of the fact that there is theft that goes online, there's vandalism, there's all kinds of criminal activity, there's snooping, there's harassing, there's defamation. There was a recent case which many of you probably read about in Michigan of someone actually threatening the life of someone else online. There is a kind of amusing case of an electronic rape online. And there are also enormous potentials for terrorism, for espionage, for the seamy side of life. There are pedophiles, there's pornography, etc. I hate to be the sort of negative person on this technology, but I think we have to recognize that in order to develop, to shape this technology into a pleasant village, into the kind of village that we want to live in, we're going to have to come to grips with those problems, and they're not going to be easy. I also want to suggest that there are some differences between these kinds of behaviors committed online and these kinds of behaviors committed offline. In particular, I want to draw attention to two characteristics. The first one is anonymity. People who engage in socially undesirable behavior online are often able to maintain their anonymity, that is, and often they actually have pseudonymity, that is, they take on identities that aren't their real identities. And anonymity, in certain contexts, I think has positive values, that is, people are much freer to say things that they wouldn't say otherwise, which it's good to have them say. But at the same time, anonymity seems to free people to behave in ways that they wouldn't behave in if we saw them face to face, if we knew who they were. Anonymity also, as is probably obvious, makes it very difficult to track down and catch people who engage in undesirable behavior. The second characteristic I want to point out is increased scope. And really what I mean by that is power. That is, people who engage in this kind of antisocial behavior online are able to do much more powerful acts. So in other words, if I say something libelous against someone online, I'm able to spread that information, that false information, across the world very quickly and very easily. In general, any kind of act is more powerful in the sense that I can reach much farther, and it's with much simpler physical behaviors. So we're going to have to deal with those characteristics of the electronic village. And I also have to draw attention to the fact that one of the big issues that we'll have to address is freedom of speech, because these are issues that have already risen, and we're going to have to worry both about freedom of speech in the sense that there are some things that we don't want people to say. That is, we don't want them to libel us or slander us. We don't want our children exposed to pornography and obscenity, that at least we want to be able to control that. At the same time, we also have to worry about the government reacting to those situations with sort of coming down too hard and making the electronic village a place in which you really don't have freedom of speech, in the sense that everything that you're saying is being observed by the government. It's a tough one. It's a really complex issue. It's enormously complex offline, and it becomes even more complex online. The other thing I would like to do is sort of really play on the metaphor of the village. I think we have to remember that villages are complex and diverse places, that in physical geographic villages we have a variety of public and private spaces. We have the public square, and we have streets which are considered public, and anything that you do there, you wouldn't be surprised at being observed. Also in geographic villages, we have private spaces. We have homes, and we have rooms in those homes in which we expect other people not to be watching us or observing what we're saying. And then we have a whole range of sort of places that are in between these extremes of public and private. We have workplaces. We have government offices and courts, which have different standards of behavior. We have churches, we have stores, our businesses, etc. And one of the big issues will be trying to see seeing whether or not we can have that variety in the electronic village, or whether we will make the mistake and make the space entirely public or entirely private. That is a real challenge. The government will certainly be pressures on the government to try to define the space as public everywhere, public in the sense that the government wants to be able to observe everything so that they can control the antisocial and undesirable behavior. We will probably be able to get some degree of privacy by using encryption techniques to encrypt our messages to one another, or data and information. But whether or not the encryption techniques that we use will all be able to be decrypted by the government or someone else will be a big issue. Finally, I just want to say we ought to worry in terms of the quality of life about what the electronic village will do to our geographic and three-dimensional physical villages, because I think the more and more we spend time communicating with people online means less and less time spent with people who are living geographically close to us. I'm sort of concerned that our identities and who we are and our alliances will become stronger and stronger with those people who we communicate with who are physically distant, but who we have lots in common with, and we'll have less and less to do with people who are living next door, less and less investment in what's happening to our geographical, physical villages.
Thanks, Deborah. While you were talking, I was thinking of something that's quite different between these two types of villages, and I'd like to hear what you have to say about it. In geographic villages, particularly children, but all of us really, we meet each other physically, and after we get to know each other physically, we get to know each other's interests and beliefs and opinions. It's my impression that in electronic villages, people tend to meet each other through their interest, opinions, beliefs, and then later, and in many cases never at all, they meet each other physically. This is just a difference between the two types of villages. Do you think they work against each other, or do they work for each other? Do you have any comments?
I don't know about them working for or against each other. I think that we're ambivalent about those differences, in the sense that I think our values often suggest that what's important about us is not our physical characteristics, but our ideas, our minds, our thoughts. And so we're able to share those online. And so many people believe that we can have the same quality, equally, maybe more valuable relationships online than offline, in the sense that physical appearance, race, gender, class can be eliminated from the environment if we don't have video hookups with our computers. But at the same time, if I can refer back to my mention of anonymity, the bottom line test for identity is seeing a person face to face. So not having that face-to-face physical presence of one another opens the door to all kinds of deception and fraud and miscuing. I may think I'm communicating with the same person I communicated yesterday and not be. I may think I'm communicating with 3 different people when actually it's the same person playing different games. That seems to me to make a big difference. It will be partly alleviated when we have video hookups with our computer hookups, but I think then we'll also have the possibility of people disguising themselves via video. That is, I have an image come up instead of my image.
Yeah, that's a mind-boggling prospect. This is the, I think this is frequently referred to as the no one knows you're a dog in cyberspace problem. So thank you for your thoughts on that, and get those questions warmed up. There's a lot of material here. Our 6th guide and our closing presenter in our opening session here is Marc Rotenberg. Marc?
Thank you. Steve Acker mentioned earlier today that 1994 was remarkable because for the first time in history, the sale of personal computers surpassed the sale of color televisions. 1994 was remarkable for another reason. For the first time in history, a majority of Americans, in response to a public opinion poll, said that they were very concerned about privacy. In fact, 84% of Americans said they were concerned about privacy, when the Lou Harris organization asked, "What are your feelings toward privacy?" It is perhaps not surprising that as our country has raced forward with new technologies, so too have our concerns about privacy grown greater. Technologies have a voracious appetite for personal information. Everything you say, every place you go, every word you write can now be easily recorded and stored and used at a later point in time. And so, for this reason, we have one of the greatest challenges facing us in this new age of digital information. What exactly is privacy? It's a question that's not easy to answer. Philosophers speak sometimes of autonomy, the sense of personhood, or perhaps individuality. My own view of privacy is a highly dynamic one. I think each day we experience both private life and public life. We are here together this afternoon to talk publicly about our views of the electronic village. Later today, we will be at home with our friends and our families and have private life, where we share our thoughts and our secrets with close friends. In many ways, the electronic world that is growing up around us shares these same attributes. We can speak publicly on an electronic bulletin board. We can express the most ferocious opinion about a political issue that other people, the denizens of cyberspace, may care about. And at the same time, we communicate privately. We send messages about particular issues, about sensitive topics, about things that we would want perhaps just a few people to know, to selected recipients of those words. And so the public and the private coexist. But it is a very difficult challenge to understand how privacy will be protected in this new information age. Consider, for example, the technology of cryptology. This is a method for encoding information. Words that you speak or words that you write can be translated into a text that no one else can read. They can go through the information pipes, come out at the other end. The person who's supposed to get the message will be able to see what you've said. But law enforcement, for example, has argued that this will frustrate the ability to conduct criminal investigation. And philosophers are equally concerned about the use of anonymity and absolute privacy to frustrate accountability and public responsibility. And so we have difficult choices to make with issues such as privacy. What type of technologies will we permit? What type of laws will we pass? I am of the view that we're going to have to struggle with this issue for quite some time to come, because I believe we are at the beginning of a process. We are just today taking our first steps into these electronic pools, these electronic communities. We are seeing the early stages of formation and the early development when electronic messaging becomes more important than the telephone call or than the letter. What is to be done? We need a good discussion, a careful discussion that looks closely at our political history and our legal history. You know, the framers of our Constitution, who wrote in the 18th century about the rights of man and the rights of citizens, understood that individuals, to participate freely in political life, would need certain inalienable rights: the right to speak freely without restriction, the right to have private thought and private belief, the right to be secure in one's home. These values of the 18th century will no doubt be just as important in the 21st. But how are we going to protect them? The Constitution doesn't give us easy answers. And so I suspect what we will need to do is join together, work together, to come up with solutions to protect what has been described by some as the most comprehensive of all rights, and that is the right of privacy.
Thanks, Mark. Do we think of privacy in the United States the way people around the world think about privacy, or are there big differences there? I ask because we've been talking about it in a national context, but in point of fact, these networks are going to be global, and I'm interested whether we in the United States think the same way about privacy as, say, like people in Europe or South Asia, or could you give us some input on that?
Yeah, I think we have different traditions. We have different laws, certainly, and different cultural expectations. But the concept of privacy is universal, particularly when you look at communications. People understand a sealed letter. They understand, the seal on parchment, going back before, in the early days of communication. And as global networks stretch from country to country, the need to protect the privacy of information grows. So I think it's a universal concept, or maybe we express it differently.
Here's the next question, the objectionable material question. In the past, the regulation of media content has been based on community standards. In the electronic village, where geography no longer matters, will we be forced to impose a national standard for media regulation? And if we have to do that, will this have a chilling effect on the free flow of information? We have 2 or 3 other questions that pick up pieces of this. Should the internet access and use be censored? Will these electronic tools empower us to be more knowledgeable of diverse ideas, or will they enslave us to the ideas that we're already being exposed to? Marc, what is the federal scene on this issue right now?
Because what we were able to regulate appropriately in a broadcast environment with a national television network or a large metropolitan radio station, that type of regulatory approach may not be appropriate when we're talking about the highly decentralized nature of the internet. It would be like trying to regulate bookstores and newsstands and college libraries and so forth. I think, therefore, what we need to do is to allow communities to develop the standards that they feel are appropriate for the type of speech that members of those communities, real and virtual, find acceptable, and to give people the right and the freedom to move between communities. We are each day members of multiple communities where different standards of conduct are appropriate. But the effort, and this is a very critical issue, the effort to try to regulate all of the speech across the internet, because there are some things out there that some people understandably find objectionable, I think would be a great mistake.
Let me ask another question. Well, first of all, Deborah, we have a question from Pittsburgh that asks you to elucidate what you meant by electronic mail rape. How is it actually done? And I'm bringing that up because I think we would all agree that that is an objectionable behavior. We're talking about free speech, we're talking about freedom of expression, and before we move this conversation on to what can be done about this, could you just offer some more on that single question?
The case that I read about was a case, it was written up by Paul Dibble, I think. Do you remember? And in Wired, was it? Did it appear? And it goes like this. This was, it took place on a MUD, which is a multi-user dungeon group, which is a place on the internet in which it's a game, which people from across the world can participate. And they participate by taking on certain identities in a medium which is like a house or a physical place. It has different rooms. And as you enter, it tells you what room you're in, and you can move about, and it tells you who else is in the room, and then your character can interact with the other characters. Now, what happened was, and by the way, the characters are not necessarily gendered. They're actually, it's ambiguous. And one of the rules of this MUD is that you can't, it's set up technologically so that you cannot put the words in the mouth of another character. You can only speak for your character. One of the participants in this group violated that rule and had his character rape another character, and then was able to have that happen by putting words in the mouth of the character that was being raped. The people in the MUD were actually extremely upset and horrified because it was a level of violence within the mud that hadn't happened before. And so they actually felt that this person had done a terrible thing that had sort of violated the rules, and they were all offended by it and upset, and actually eventually banished this person from the mud. Now, so it's interesting. I mean, it's interesting. I think it's deep. It raises deep questions because, well, rape is a complicated thing, needless to say. But the thing that I wanted us. Well, do I need to say more?
Of course you need to say more. What we're working on here is the question of there are good things and bad things happening in cyberspace, and some objectionable behaviors and objectionable materials that are well known in our physical communities are now being found in our electronic communities. So do we need legislation? Do we need social measures? Do we need better values clarification? Let's move on to that question.
Yeah, well, let me say, I think that it's important to understand that even though it wasn't physically or three-dimensionally a rape, the participants in the situation interpreted it, treated it as rape, and were unhappy with the behavior of the person online, and took appropriate actions. Now, the problem, of course, is that that person can come back and has evidently, if you read the story, using another identity. So the behavior, in some sense, the behavior has been controlled internally
by
the
community
system,
standards.
By community standards. Some people would say that this is an example, a model of how social rules should develop in electronic communities. And in fact, I have read at least one thing where the argument has been made that flaming, which is another form of getting angry online and sort of sending voluminous and hostile messages to somebody who has behaved in a way that the group didn't like. One person has argued at least that this is actually good to happen because it helps online communities develop their standards and articulate those standards.
Excellent.
But I mean, it's still, I think that that's limited to fairly small, well-defined groups. And the problem is you're always going to have people, I mean, other groups have expressed other problems with people sort of joining in, behaving in ways they don't like, and they can't quite kick them out. They have to reassemble somewhere else, and then the troublesome person can follow them, etc.
But I did want to observe that the article we've been discussing here, I think, originally appeared in an issue of the Village Voice in December of 1993 under the title of A Rape in Cyberspace. And one of the interesting aspects of that article is that the master of the MOO, a system operator, did originally purge the offending individual as a matter of autocratic action, and then the whole situation became even more complicated because it was not only the behavior of the rapist, the cyber rapist, it was also the behavior of the system administrator that came into question in that community. But there was a community response to the objectionable behavior, objectionable materials, just like there would be in a physical community.
Good afternoon. My question tends toward government regulation, and can it be legal to bring up an email message in a court of law as admissible evidence? And also, if it is illegal for police to copy and tap phone messages, even though email is open to everyone, shouldn't it also be illegal for police to copy and record email messages?
Mark?
Yeah, the federal wiretap law, which was passed in 1968, was amended in 1986 to deal specifically with the problem you've described. That law, which is called the Electronic Communications Privacy Act, tries to give some privacy both to stored electronic mail that sits on a system, and also electronic mail in transit. Now, like most privacy laws, it's not an absolute right of privacy. What it does is it creates a presumption of privacy and says now in specific circumstances, we will allow the information to be disclosed. So, for example, the police do have the right to get access to private electronic mail if they have obtained a proper search warrant. They don't have the right to go to a commercial service provider or to a university and say simply, give us all the electronic mail on this individual. That would be considered a violation of the Fourth Amendment. So we have, therefore, this very important principle, and it's a good example, I think, of the type of policy making we'll need to do in the years ahead. How do we take a principle, for example, of privacy in the Fourth Amendment and extend it to new forms of communications?